Welcome back, and thank you for joining me on the weekly update with my worm bins. As always, I start with my regular totes, and this week for the regular totes, I do believe I have found the right combination with adding the mosquito screen to the top and using the bubble wrap only where I feed the bins. So you can see a real distinct difference between where the bubble wrap was and wasn't, and the material over here feels really good. It's gonna feel different, I'm figuring out, from the vermi bag totes. It doesn't feel exactly the same as that, but the castings have a good consistency. They hold together, they're not mushy on the drier side as compared to where the bubble wrap was. So it's trending in the right direction for me, so I'm happy about that. One thing I'm noticing as well is that even though I had a lot of material about 4 weeks ago, I thought I had enough in my bins. As it is composting down, the amount of material is reducing. I am still going to take this bin to a harvest stage. I am not going to add more material like I did for the one vermi bag tote, but I know for next time, let it fill a little bit more than I think it should, and then have it compost down. Other than that, the worms are looking great. I've got a nice bunch of worms on the side where the food was. Not a lot of food particles left, so I'm going to give this a normal to smaller size feeding. It is going to go, I think I'm going to try to harvest this probably by mid-May. So it is going to go to a harvest stage. So I want to make sure that any of the larger particles are getting composted down and the worms take care of that. And then once it's fed, today they are getting some bananas and peppers, things that I know the worms really enjoy. But once it's fed, it gets its grit and bubble wrap, and then this one is set up for the next week. Over to my second regular tote bin. With this one, I noticed the same improvements. The side that did not have any bubble wrap dried out really well, but it's not dry to the point of crunchy. It's just no longer wet to the point of being mushy, which is what I prefer. And in this bin, I still have quite a few cocoons that are on the bubble wrap. So activity has kicked up for the reproduction of the worms since the spring, which is good to note. And as I sift through this material, it does feel a lot better than it's felt at any time during this particular composting cycle. So I'm very happy with this bin as well. And I'm also going to try to harvest this one in a couple of weeks as well too. So I want to encourage the worms to break down what is here. So I'm going to make smaller portions of the fresh food that I give into the bin so that they can work through some of the cardboard material. But pocket feeding is a great way to keep an eye on your worm colony. There's a ton of worms on the side where the food was. And when you do this pocket feeding, all the worms tend to migrate back and forth to the sides where the food is. So if you notice you don't have a lot of worms on the side where the food is, and there's not, of course, not a lot of worms on the other side, you might want to check to see what's going on, like try to look for some cocoons, see if it's too dry, because that's definitely going to give you a good idea of how many worms you have in there. So I am with the number of worms that exist in here, and with this one there's really nothing to report in terms of things that are concerning. So it's going to get a regular feeding, same thing, bananas, a little bit of melon and some peppers. It's grit, the bubble wrap, and it's set up for the next week. Now on to the vermi bag totes. This is the tote that I'm going to be harvesting at the end of the month. So with this one, I am trying to encourage the worms to break down the large particles. Now, everything that is in the bin won't get broken down in my case. Depending on what type of materials you use, you might get to the point where you don't see any additional particles. But I use shredded cardboard, and in that shredded cardboard, sometimes the ink or plastic that is used with it doesn't get broken down. So I find that I'll have a lot of bits of things that do not get broken down. But for the most part, the castings themselves have turned over to this really deep, dark brown color. They definitely feel heavier. It's reduced in size. So this bin is definitely ready for harvest, but I do want to give it just 1 or 2 more weeks before I begin the baiting period. So I'm just sifting through this, making sure to bring any of the castings towards the bottom up. Now this is actually not a chunk of cardboard. This is all worms that are still chewing on what was in the bin last week. And as I said, with pocket feeding, it is a very good way to keep an eye on what your colony is doing, how many worms you still have in there. So the worms are concentrated in that ball. It's not all of them. There are still some that are throughout the castings, but that was a large portion of them. So unlike the regular totes, this will get a smaller feeding than the other bins. And then, like I said, in about a week or 2, I'm going to take these castings out of the tote and put them into the harvest tray that I use and begin the baiting process. Also, since I am putting a limited amount of food in here, I'm gonna put some of the grit on top just to give them another source of potential food, because there is neem cake in this, which is something that they can munch on as well as the eggshell. And then this is set up for the next week. My second vermi bag tote is not going to any type of migration or harvest, because I did add additional cardboard to this one to raise the level, because it was definitely lower than its counterpart. And on this one, the worms are still hanging out on top of the bubble wrap, but still no evidence of them roaming around the edges like they're unhappy with the material. So my thoughts remain the same in that they are just hanging out for some air. They're not unhappy with the environment. These castings are definitely wetter than the castings in the other vermi bag tote, and I know it's because of the cardboard that's in here. So I'm just taking care to make sure this gets mixed up. And since it's also getting pocket fed, looking for any large colonies of worms. And this I thought was a piece of food. Turns out it was just a ginormous worm ball. So I'm just going to set that one to the side. But I am finding more chunks of food in this particular bin. So as always, all I'm doing is fluffing, making sure that anything on the bottom comes to the top so that it doesn't get heavy and wet towards the bottom, and looking for any large particles of food. And then I'm going to feed it up on the opposite side that it had gotten food before. This is going to get a slightly larger portion than any of the other totes because it's not going towards a harvest anytime soon. And then once it gets this grit, I'll put the bubble wrap on and close it up for another week. And now my last bin, which is my only flow-through system, the Vermi Bag Mini. Flow-through systems are great because you can put a ton of material in these, and when you harvest, you're not completely restarting the bin over again. You're just continuing what you're doing at the top with adding material weekly and just harvesting it from the bottom. Typically, this bin for me runs really dry around the edges, and the edges of this one have gotten drier over the weeks, which I would think it would actually get wetter just like my other bins, but more surface area is exposed to the air, and this bin, the edges just get crispy and crispy. So I am trying to move the material on the sides over into the middle where most of the moisture is in this bin, just to make sure that none of the worms end up drying out on the sides and they have a good area of places to go to escape into some wetter areas of the bin. Now this bin, again, the worms were chilling at the top. They looked happy, and I'm going to give them a good size feeding. One, because the melons hold a lot more water, and so do the peppers, so I want to get that into this bin and hope that it disperses throughout. And two, because I will be harvesting this along with the other vermi bag tote. So I want to make sure the worms are at the top and not towards the bottom. So this is to encourage them to come up to the top. And once it's fed, it's all set. There's no major concerns with this one. So it's set for another week. I'll replace the bubble wrap and it's all good to go. I hope you've enjoyed the content. Please like and subscribe if you have. And if you want to watch the video on how I make my starting mixture, just click the link below. Thanks for watching.